G'day everyone, welcome to another Azure RoundUP session. Today we've got Zoheb Shaikh, who's going to cover off Azure AD Password protection for us. So Zoheb, seen a preview of what you've already done internally at Microsoft. I'm really looking forward to you sharing with our external community. First of all, thank you very much for volunteering and looking forward to the session, mate.
Thank you, George. Thank you for having me. It's so hopefully I would be able to share a few things which would be beneficial for the community. So let's see. While it's loading up, just to share with the audience, as George introduced me briefly, my name is Zoheb Shaikh. I've been with Microsoft for about 7 years now. In different roles. So I started with CSS, wherein I was working with the Microsoft Identity team. Then I moved into PFE, and now since last 2 years, I'm a part of Mission Critical team, based out of Qatar, somewhere in the Middle East. I don't know if you know it, but those who are soccer fans would definitely know it because next year FIFA is happening in Qatar. So if you don't know, then you should know where Qatar is.
I think so. In ex-PFE as well, mate. So PFE for life, as we always say, ex-PFEs.
Yes. All right. So let's get started. So I'll just give you a little bit of brief of how this conversation started with my customer and where we ended up with throughout. So one of the things which my customer was looking at was to prevent weak passwords from his organization. So the first question he asked me, like, do I have weak passwords in my environment? So I told him, of course, you do have weak passwords in your environment. But then he asked me, like, what could be, how many weak passwords I might have in my environment, which was a very tricky question. So, George, he started asking me many questions like this. I see a practice in Service Desk wherein they set weak passwords. And then I just want to know, I want to prevent weak passwords, but I also want to know what kind of password compliance I have, which was a very interesting question. Then I did my research as always, and I came up with a solution, which I'm going to talk about into our agenda completely in the next 30 minutes or so. But before I go into detail, first of all, let's try and find out what's wrong with passwords. Like, why are we worried about passwords? The reasons why we should be worried about passwords is because there has been increasing security breaches since many, many, many years. Like just in 2019, we had over 5 billion leaked credentials processed just in 2019, and over 50 million accounts compromised just in 2019. Now, as Microsoft, we are telling our customers that, you know what, go passwordless. Use Windows Hello for Business, use Azure AD MFA and these kind of things. But, customers would go there. But while they are going there, what do you do with your passwords? And what do you do with your weak passwords? Now, if I am an attacker, I have one of the easiest way for me to attack a user is to find out his username and then try some random passwords on his account. So I could do a password spray, which is more like a random password, or I could look at the leaked credentials. So I would, if I'm doing a password spray, basically, and if there is a user who's using a password like some weekday @ something, then it becomes easier for me to hack that particular user, which is essentially what is a worrying factor for many of the security focused organizations and CISOs, that how do I prevent it? Yes, passwordless is fine, but till the time we get there, how do I improve my password compliance from an organization perspective? So this is basically one of the major challenges which we have today, that people are using common passwords. Password spray attack, as we checked in the last slide, it continues to increase. And there is no inbuilt solution to ban weak password. I'll tell you, George, a funny story with one of my customers. So back when I was in Microsoft support, and this is way back in 2012 or 13, I was a part of Microsoft Directory Services team. And I got one of the cases that, the customer says that I have blocked p@SSWORD, this password, but still I'm able to reset it. Then I was thinking, like, how did he do that? So he told me that they are used. There is of course, there's a password filter.dll, which we know, which resides on domain controller. In fact, it's there on all the client machines also. So they kind of modified the password filter.dll. And I realized that's a known way of blocking your passwords. Okay, blocking common passwords. Now, the problem which he and by the way, this is not supported, okay, which this password filter.dll, this is not a good way of doing it. But the reason I'm talking about this is because I want to tell you what problem is with this, with doing it this way. So he kind of modified password filter.dll on all the DCs, and then they upgraded one of the DCs, okay, domain controllers. And of course, he forgot to update the password filter.dll. Now, there were many reasons why this could happen. Like if there's a Microsoft update and if you forget, then of course your password filter.dll is not going to work. Plus, the problem is it makes your password reset extremely slow. And you see, now we've got 5 billion leaked credentials in 2019. Are you saying you could have 5 billion types of random passwords inside password for filter.dll? No way, it's not possible. So essentially, there is no inbuilt solution. The few workaround or unsupported ways also which are there, this is very, very limited. Like you can't do much with it. There is limitation which you'll hit when you are entering some random passwords. And plus you don't get any reporting and anything like that. So yes, so basically there's no inbuilt solution for password filter, for doing any kind of password filter. But we do have solution from an Azure AD perspective. And this is what I'm going to talk about. So when Azure AD released Azure AD Password Protection, it was released only for our cloud-only users. So if you're cloud-only, and if you're setting your passwords in cloud, then you could use Azure AD Password Protection. But back in 2017 or late 2017, we added these capabilities into Azure AD Password Protection on premises also. Now, what it does is we, as Microsoft, have a global banned password list, which is based on the intelligence of Azure Active Directory and based on the intelligence which we receive from many third-party organizations also. So we have built a global banned password list, which comprises of all or most of the known compromised or leaked passwords. This is something which we build in. And so this in itself prevents organizations majorly from a password leak and a password spray attacks, because then if you're using this capability, then you're kind of ensuring that the worldwide leak passwords is something which is not being used. Another thing which comes with Azure AD Password Protection is I'm able to build my own custom banned password list. Now, George, you might understand, like, typically as humans, we have a tendency of using passwords which is localized, like the street where the organization is or where my headquarters is. I would write a password with that name, or I would write if I'm in Microsoft, I might write passwords which might have MS or Microsoft or PFE, some known words I might be able to write. So it's very important that to prevent your organization from a non-global and more like a local attack, you have a custom banned password list also. And this is important for my personal organization perspective also. So that is something which your custom banned password list kind of helps you. So global banned password list is global. It's kind of live. It keeps on updating. And then I've got a custom banned password list, which is more like local. And I want to prevent what I know from an organizational perspective, what is being used and what is not being used. I kind of want to integrate it. And of course, I want it brings in capability to integrate your cloud intelligence into on-prem. So the intelligence which we are bringing in from Azure Active Directory to my on-prem Active Directory, that is something which Azure AD Password Protection brings in as well. And another important feature is the smart lockout, which I love it, and I'm going to talk about it in the next slide also. So traditionally, one of the things which Active Directory admins and the users more have been affected is by lockouts. So there is a bad password attempt, and then you lock yourself out. You don't want to be in that kind of a situation wherein you're not able to do your work because your credentials are locked or your account is locked. How do you prevent it? Azure AD password protection, or this is more of an Azure AD feature, not the password protection feature, but it kind of brings in capability, and Azure AD password protection is compliant with this capability called Smart Lockout. In this, essentially, if there is an attacker who's trying to attack your account, then the attacker will be locked out, but you won't be locked out. So what the smart lockout does is it tries to find out, and this is something which is inbuilt into Azure Active Directory. It tries to find out where the attacker is coming from and things like that, and it's just going to block the attacker. But a genuine user who's entering the right credentials and who has a session open will continue to work. So this kind of ensures that you as a user are not affected by this change, and you continue to work, but at the same time we are able to have an acceptable level of security, and I'm able to lock out the attacker then and there. Moving on, so as I said, Azure AD password protection is really the power of Azure, which is coming to your on-premises. I'm able to build on the intelligence which I'm getting from Azure, and we are receiving billions of authentication attempts every day. So as Microsoft, we are in a position by ourselves to know like what's going on around the world in terms of leaked credentials and what's happening. And other than that, we have intelligence from some third-party organizations also to help us in building this global banned password list. And this is why we are able to integrate our cloud users and our on-prem users also for using Azure AD password protection. So no matter if you're resetting your password from your desktop, like if you're just doing a Control-Alt-Delete screen and resetting your password, if your AD admin is resetting the password from AD users and computers, or if you're using Azure SSPR, Azure Self-Service Password Reset, and trying to reset, all the password protection capabilities I discussed, they apply in all these cases. So basically, it's a hybrid solution, and it integrates very well with your cloud as well, with Azure AD and on-prem Active Directory, of course. Okay. Moving forward, now what does it? What kind of value does it bring to an organization? First of all, it brings in improved security, which means I'm able to eliminate easily guessable password, lower the risk of password spray attack, and I'm able to get access to the Microsoft global banned password list. Because remember, there is no way you'll be able to build the global banned password list by yourself. So that is something which you get. You're able to customize some controls in your Azure Active Directory by doing smart lockout and banned password lists. And when I discussed about smart lockout, I gave you an example of 10 bad password attempts in 60 seconds and you're locked. This is something which is customizable. You could reduce the lockout duration to a higher value. You could make it 15 minutes. You could make the bad password attempts to be less. So that is something which is completely customizable, and you are able to control it. And it totally depends on what kind of protection you're looking at. And then the another important part is it brings the synergy between Azure Active Directory and on-prem Active Directory. So I'm able to ban the same password in a hybrid setup. So I'm really using both of these features together. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about deployment, since I think we have discussed pretty much about features. So we are in a good position to talk a little bit about deployment and what does it really take to deploy it. So this is something which is done through Azure AD admin portal. So you just need to download the agents and customize your banned password list. And as I discussed, it uses the same algorithm and data as Azure, and it is very easy to deploy. And I'm just going to share it with you very quickly. And I'm going to give you a couple of tips and tricks also as to how you could do it in an easy way. Now, as I said, from a deployment perspective, there are three important components here. So there are three kind of agents, two agents, and one is the file, which is extremely important in this process. One is the Azure AD password protection proxy service, which you see at the top of my diagram. The second, which you see, is Azure AD Password Protection DC Agent Service. This is something which is installed on the domain controller. And then you have got, of course, your password filter DLLs, which is basically stored, which is basically on the domain controllers also. There is another component which is extremely important here, which you see is at the bottom, which is sysvol. So, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. So now, first question is,
can I just quickly ask?
Yes.
Students might be thinking, do they need to have AAD Connect synced and set up to use this service, or can they use it without that being set up? I'm assuming the answer is yes, because it's a hybrid scenario, correct?
Yes, yes. So
Yep.
that's a very good question, George. And so we are assuming kind of that they are going to need Azure AD Connect here, but just from an architecture perspective, Azure AD Connect is not a dependency. However, it might be a dependency from a licensing perspective. So technically, even without Azure AD Connect, I'm able to protect my on-prem AD. But what you need here as a prerequisite is Azure AD P1 or P2 licenses. So that is something which you're definitely going to need. But yeah, you can get away. Let's assume a scenario. I have a customer who wants to use this feature and who are not synchronizing against Azure AD. They could use it. They could install agent, and they would obviously have to talk to Azure AD. So they need Azure AD, but they don't have to be user synchronized. But they need certain licensing to be in Azure AD to be able to use this feature. So yeah. Okay. So yeah, coming back to the architecture scenario. So first thing which I'm going to need is the Azure AD P1, of course, or P2 to be able to use this feature. And then I will be installing these two agents, Azure AD Password Protection Proxy Service, and then the Azure AD Password Protection DC Agent Service. The DC Agent Service is something which runs on the domain controller. Now you might ask me that why we don't have, why do we have proxy and not directly DC Agent Service? So the reason is you don't want your DCs to talk to the internet in general. Now here, it's not a full internet, but there are certain URLs which we are whitelisting for Azure for the proxy agent to speak with Azure AD. So what the proxy agent does is it basically downloads the policies. And it's very important for us to be able to download the updated policies because the banned password list, it keeps growing. It keeps growing with time, with every day, every week, there is some kind of update which is happening into our global banned password list. So that's why we need to be able to download the updated policies. They can be downloaded on the DC or they can be downloaded on a member server. One thing which I personally felt works very well for me is downloading the proxies agents on the Azure AD Connect server, because most of the time Azure AD Connect servers are already whitelisted for the URLs which the password protection proxy service needs. So this is kind of a quick win for me, because if I'm going to an organization and I'm wanting them to deploy these services, so I just have to tell them that, you know what, let's install these proxy services on the Azure AD Connect primary and the staging. And hopefully they have both, because ideally they should have a staging and a primary Azure AD Connect. So if I install it on both, I'm good, basically. And I might have the URLs already whitelisted. So it makes my deployment very easy. And then, of course, I install the password filter, the agents, Azure AD Password Protection DC agents on the domain controller. Now, what these DC agents do is they pull the data from the proxy service every 1 hour. So every 60 minutes, they're going to the proxy service and they pull the data and then they put it into the sysvol container. And of course, the sysvol is being replicated using DFSR. And we hope they're using DFSR and no longer using FRS. So if they are using DFSR to replicate, it would replicate very fast across the domain controller, which means it syncs. And as you know, Active Directory is a multi-master replica engine. So if you store it, if you download it on one of the sysvol, it would ideally replicate to all the sysvol containers. Which is every 1 hour, it is going to download it. So which is quite fast. Another thing which it does is which you have an option to do, and which is what one of my customers asked. Like, what if I want to do incremental deployment of it? I don't want to do DC agent deployment on all the DCs, but I have 50 DCs. I want to start off with 10. So it can do 10, okay? But the problem is the password protection only applies on the 10 DCs. It won't apply on the 40 DCs, which means whichever user is going to those 10 DCs, he's going to be protected against the weak password. And if you go outside those 10 DCs, then of course you're not protected, which is something which is not good, but it is it is supported, the supported way of deployment if you want to incrementally deploy also by us. Okay. Now another important question here, which I want to answer here, is password policies are specific to Azure AD tenants. Okay. So we are assuming kind of you have a single Azure AD tenant. So it's based on an Azure AD tenant. If you have got multiple Azure AD tenants, then the architecture which you see in front of me, you are going to need these many architectures differently, because it's really a single Azure AD tenant kind of a policy which we have.
And I've definitely seen a few customers who've got multiple tenants in some instances where they got, say, dev and they've got test and they've got their own tenants in dev and test for whatever particular reason they've come up with that architecture. So they would actually obviously then need the equivalent dev test domain controllers in the same architecture, correct?
Exactly. So you will have separate proxy agents and separate DC agents and their synchronization set up separately. So it's a tenant-based deployment. But if you have like a single forest, multiple domains, and you are a single tenant organization, this kind of works without any problem. Now this slide just kind of takes you through of what I already discussed as to how would you go about in deploying the Azure AD password protection. So you're obviously going to whitelist the URLs, you're going to download and install the agents, and that's it. So I mean that's actually what all you need to do. Yes. So it's quite straightforward. And you know, when I speak with a lot of customers, just the capabilities which this brings and the ease of deployment which it has, it's exactly opposite. So the capabilities is very complex and very beneficial for an organization, but from a deployment perspective, it's very, very straightforward for you to deploy it.
I'm really glad to see that we've got this set up in a hybrid way with that in place. I remember teaching a security course a couple of years ago when this first came out, and I don't recall back then I think it was only in Azure AD back then when we first released this, if I'm not mistaken. And they're also, and I don't believe when it first came out we could have custom banned passwords either. I could be wrong, but it's good to see that it's evolved. So this is really good.
Definitely. And you know, I remember, George, I was in one of the conversation, and I might be wrong with the dates, but this was in 2017 November. And one of my customers, he had a password spray attack, because of which their ADFS infrastructure went down, because it was kind of a DDoS. Their ADFS was completely down, and then they were trying to figure out, and there was a password spray attack. So the customer asked me, do you have a solution? And I told him, let me check, because, you know, this is the thing with Azure, things keep evolving. And I believe this was like somewhere in 2017, November, or somewhere around that time, it was released in preview. And then I figured out, you know, actually we have a solution for this, which was great.
Yeah, it's cool. It's really
all
cool.
Right. So let's talk about now of the customizations which we did for our customer, and then I'll tell you how exactly we can do this customization, or you could do this customization. So the Azure AD password protection can generally be deployed in two modes. One is the audit mode, and the other one is enforce mode. So enforce I'll talk about in a minute. Audit mode is wherein I've enforced password protection, but I'm only auditing it, which means the users are able to set whatever passwords they want to, but I'm only going to audit these, and I'm not going to kind of enforce these passwords. So they are still allowed, which works fine. Now, the reason why organizations might want to do this is because they want to audit what kind of password how many users who have reset their passwords and their passwords are weak or something like that. They want to audit it
Yeah.
before they implement in production because they want to know what kind of impact I have in my organization. Now, this is the exact intention which my customer had as well, which I spoke about at the beginning. So the intention was to find out what kind of compliance do I have from a password perspective and then import it. Now, there's an inbuilt reporting. Directly, you could do it from a domain controller. This is something which we call a usage reporting. So there's a nice PowerShell commandlet. You could just run it, get Azure AD password protection summary, and it kinds of give you a summary that you know what these many people changed passwords, these many people validated, these were good passwords, these were failures, blah blah blah. So it kind of gives you a summary. Uh, so my customer was fine with it, but what the requirement came was like I want something more to this. Now, so this is good, but he wanted something user specific. Then I, along with the mission critical team, we started checking what could be a different ways of achieving this, and we figured out that while it is doing the password audits, there are certain events which is generated. And of course, these events are documented publicly. We tried to find out what these events mean. So like, for example, there's a 10024 event, which you see on top of your screen. And then there is a 30010 event. So these events essentially tell you that if this is compliant against the global banned password list, uh, or is this not compliant? So there are events which is generated. Now, what we really did is we collated all these events and tried to deploy a dashboard for the customer. So we kind of parsed all the events from the domain controller in audit mode, and we helped them deploy a dashboard, something like this. So it's a Power BI dashboard, which is totally based on the event. And this kind of gives me like how many users have reset their passwords, what is the password count, how many would have failed, how many would have passed, uh, how many passwords were compliant or non-compliant against the global banned password lists, how many were non-compliant against the custom banned password list which you have built in. So this is something which we took data from the event, and then we just parsed this into a Power BI report, and then we were able to kind of find out like what exactly is going on here and what you need to do. Now, we did this using just events, but I shared this with one of my customers, and he found an innovative way of do it. So they use some third-party monitoring solution, and what they did is they just captured the same events, and then they were able to build a nicer dashboard into the third-party monitoring system which they had. And I realized you could do this through SCOM also. So SCOM also has ability to collect events, and then you could build a dashboard in SCOM as well. So my intention here is not to highlight how we did it, what we did it, but moreover how we figured out that this is something which we could do. This is something we also shared with the Azure AD product team as well. And yeah, so it's a nice feature for you to have. Basically, you put your Azure AD password protection in audit mode, and generally you wait for your life cycle. So if your password life cycles are, for example, 45 days, you wait for 45 days to kind of get a feel of how your compliance is. And of course, there would be few accounts which have not reset their password. Maybe users are on leave or due to some other reason. So maybe you wait a little bit more. There might be some other scenarios wherein users have not reset their password because their passwords are set to not expire, which is a very bad thing. And maybe they have a lot of service accounts which are resetting password not through the regular password cycle. So in those kind of scenarios, you would be able to find out that, you know what, these many users are resetting the password. This is what I have in the organization. Um, but yeah, you kind of get an idea as to how your password compliance are. Also, if you have some outputs like this, it also helps you find out that, you know what, how susceptible I am to a password stray attack if it happens to my organization. Now, if you have anything which is less than 90% compliance, that means you have a good chance. In fact, even 1% might be a good chance for an attacker to compromise. But you can just realize how big of an impact it might have for an organization. I'll give you another example which I've seen. So I was on site back when I was a PFE. I was on site with one of the customers, and then there was a customer, and his application was doing a bind operation to Active Directory. Now, for some reason, the bind was not working. So the customer called me and he told me that, we need to figure out why it's not working. And I went there, I took a network monitor trace, and I just filtered with the IP address of the application and the DC which it was trying to which it was trying to connect, and I figured out I could see the password in plain text, which was a local admin password and quite a privileged password because he was using simple bind. When I shared this with the customer, he was obviously shocked. So obviously you should not use simple bind, which is very bad. Yeah. Even if you have complex password, that makes it worse for you. But what I'm trying to emphasize is you should not have weak passwords in your organization. And if you have, go and implement Azure AD password protection in audit mode and try to figure out why it's a problem for you, and then potentially try and get into enforce mode. Now, what we did with one of the customers is we went a step ahead. When we got this kind of report, we got to know what kind of users are there who have weak passwords. So obviously, as an organization perspective, whenever you're doing changes, you want to be sure that this change has a minimum impact on the organization. So what one of my customer ended up doing is he ended up contacting many of these users through service desk, and they asked them, and they build a SOP to change their passwords to a little bit complex ones and not use some of the common passwords. So before going into enforce mode, they had all these prerequisites met, and they made sure that the password compliance is well above 90 or 80. And that's when they implemented a change. Because without that, what would happen is when the users try to change password, they might feel that, I used to be able to do it this before, and now I'm not able to do it. Because typically the users have a habit, like, Monday @1234. And the next month it will be Monday @1235, and it goes on like this, which is very, very bad. And yes, so essentially this is how you could prevent it. Now, this is all I spoke about so far was audit mode, but let's talk about enforce. So in audit mode, of course, what happens is you are only auditing it, nothing gets forced on the users. But when you put it into enforce mode, what happens is any unsecure passwords or any non-compliant passwords, they get blocked if you're into enforce mode. So the users will get an error message that your password doesn't meet the complexity requirement. That's what they're blocked. Please use a complex password, which is the typical message which they get. So yeah, that is something which the enforced mode is going to do. And of course, the enforced mode also is something which is done at the tenant level. Okay, so if I do it at the tenant level, and if I have got all the domain controllers agents installed, it will get enforced across. Now, of course, if you plan to incrementally deploy it, somewhere it will take effect, somewhere it will not. But yeah, in general, you would want it to be enforced globally across. One of the things which I missed when I was talking about password protection was the Azure AD password protection works in combination with your on-premises password policies. Okay, so if I have got on-premises password policies, which is set to X complexity and these kind of characters, Azure AD password protection works in combination and doesn't work separately. So you will still have your on-premises password policies, and you will have Azure AD password protection. So both these things will be there when you move into enforce mode. It's not that you will only have one. Both these continue to work in combination with each other. Yeah, so yeah, that's the dashboard which we deployed using Power BI, and I have a blog also which I have published externally. So I think, George, we can put the link in the video also for the blog, right?
We can certainly do that. I'll plonk it in here somewhere, or put it in the details. But that's great. Well, thank you very much, Zoheb. That was really informative. I'm sure a lot of people will be looking that up now, and we'll put some links into docs on password protection. But for those who haven't done that or haven't looked into it, definitely look into it, especially if you've got Azure AD P1 or P2 licensing. Oh, and before we forget, if you like the video, like it and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks again, Zob.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.